Gather round for the old-time bed turning. My name is Chris Moline. I'm an AQS certified appraiser of quilted textiles. I own the business next door, Jean S. Lyle, and I also serve on the board of the Quilters Hall of Fame. Today we're turning some antique quilts for your enjoyment. The quilt on the far wall here on my left, your right, is a Fraktur quilt. It was made by Sarah Heimbach in 1854. Sarah was a very prolific quilter. There are quilts throughout Pennsylvania museums that have been made by Sarah for her family members. This particular quilt, the signatures in the center are calligraphy done by a gentleman named James Mock, who was a famous calligrapher in the area and did the Fraktur engravings for him. It's called Fraktur because it's a highly embellished form of calligraphy. The one behind me here, on my right, your left, is a 1933 World's Fair winner from the Century of Progress. It is a Chicago quilt made by Mrs. Virginia Kern. Her husband, Dr. Nicholas Kern, was a very famous obstetrician in the Roseland district of Chicago. Mrs. Kern won an honorable mention in the Century of Progress contest with her quilt. Okay, our first quilt on the bed is a Mae Tulip. This is a Marie Webster design. This was a kit. It was available in 1934. It is hand-pieced, hand-appliqued, and hand-quilted. The size is 80 by 96. And I just love the Art Deco border here on this quilt. It's very highly indicative of the style of the time period. Our next quilt is a folk art four block. Say that fast 3 times. It's 82 inches square. It was made by Susan Smith of Massachusetts in the 1840s. It's all cotton, hand appliqued, assembled and quilted. This red, green, and white 4-block style is really a classic of that time period. But I love the whimsy of her centers where her seams would have been joined, kind of like a Rorschach test, these blobs. Now, like all quilters, of course, you know, when our work isn't quite so precise, we try to hide it a little bit. And I think she did an absolutely wonderful job hiding some of the imprecision of her applique. The next quilt is a Star of the West. It's 66 by 78 inches. The quilt is from Ohio, but the maker's name is unknown. This is from the 1890s. It's hand and machine pieced and hand quilted. Indigo quilts and 2-color quilts are very common in the 1890s. This is a wonderful example of the type. Red work. This one is 64 by 72. Now, how can you turn down a quilt that has your last name on it? Even though it is referring to Davenport, Moline. It came from the Davenport, Moline area of Iowa, Illinois, and it was completed in 1925. It's machine assembled, hand embroidered, and quilted. Now, this quilt commemorates some sad event. We don't know what it was. It occurred on September 15th or 16th in 1891, and the top probably sat around for a long time before it was finished 30 years later. The pattern of this next quilt is called Crisscross. It's 99 by 102. The maker's name is unknown, but it was made in England in around 1830. It's all cotton, hand-pieced and quilted. The unusual light colors here are a good indicator of the English making of this quilt. Most American fabrics from this time period were in the popular color scheme of the day, drab. So it would have been dark brown if it had been made in America. But all these wonderful light-colored chintzes are English chintz. The next quilt is the ever-popular Sue and Sam. It's 81 by 98. This quilt was made by my grandmother, Elna Moline, in Sioux City, Iowa, in the 1930s. It's all cotton, hand appliqued, machine assembled, and hand quilted. Now, my grandmother was a prolific quilter, but most of her work is done in embroidery and not in piecing or applique. Thus, Sue and Sam were relegated to the closet. We never knew why. It was never used, but I kind of think she didn't like Sue and Sam after she got finished with this one. And I always have wondered what Sam's doing in that. The pattern of this next quilt is called Triangles Galore. Now, technically, it's a central medallion. If you ladies could hold it up just a tidbit higher, see this little square here in the center? That's the central medallion. There are over 6,500 half-square triangles in this quilt and one small square. Now, the initials MF are cross-stitched on the back with the date of her making, 1852, in England. It is all cotton. It is English hand paper pieced and hand quilted. English paper piecing is very common in this time period, but it's usually done in hexagons, even in England. These triangles are all perfectly pieced. The corners all match. No bed turning would be complete without an old-fashioned flower garden. This is 72 by 84 inches. Unfortunately, the maker is unknown, but it is from the 1930s. It's all cotton, hand-pieced and quilted. These are 1-inch hexagons. Every hexagon is outlined in quilt stitches. Now, I love her fussy cutting all the way through most of these blocks. She's centered her little flowers so that they run right around in the rings. The pattern name for this next quilt is Fleur-De-Lis. It's 89 by 96. The quilt comes from New York in the 1840s. It's all cotton, hand-pieced, hand appliqued, and hand quilted. Large quilts are fairly common among the wealthy of this time period. We tend to forget that those feather beds were very high, and that dictated larger bed coverings. Some of them even go all the way to the floor so that they can hide stuff under the bed. Does that sound familiar? The next quilt is How the Elephant Got His Trunk. It's 66 by 90. The kit that this is made from was first produced in 1934, and the images relate to the Rudyard Kipling story, How the Elephant Got His Trunk. It's all cotton, machine-pieced, hand appliqued, embroidered, and quilted. Now, the maker of this quilt followed the instructions in the kit very carefully. The kit never told her to remove the paper from behind the applique, so it's still there. Now, the kit also didn't tell you how to finish the corners of the quilt. So every example of this quilt, the corners are finished a little differently. This lady just sewed them up and then appliqued around it, or well, bound around it, and just let it go. Others you'll see binding or bias that's across those corners. You'll see the corners cut, they'll be curved, but every one of these kits, the maker had to figure out how to finish it off. The next quilt is a Wild Goose Chase. It's 108 by 120. It's probably from the Massachusetts area and was made in the 1830s. Again, one of those very large quilts over a high feather bed. Now, the colors in this quilt are very indicative of the style of the period, and the very fine quilting, her little undulating vine of feathers in the rows and column sashing are just wonderfully executed. This next quilt is the Prince '(S) feather. Not a princess feather, but a Prince '(S). Now, the distinction between the Prince's feather or Prince Albert's feather, his feather is straight. The princess, her feather is curved. So this is the prince's feather. It's 96 by 98. The maker is unknown, but it is a Pennsylvania quilt and was made in the 1850s. All cotton, hand-pieced, appliqued, and quilted. Again, this is very typical of a red, green, and white of the period, and I just love those border bows. Aren't they just precious? Now the quilting in this quilt, each of the quilt open areas in the body of the quilt, every quilt design is different. So it's very heavily quilted. This quilt is called Seasons in the Sun. It's from the Little Brown Cocoa books. It's 88 by 92. The maker's name is unknown, but this quilt came from the south side of Chicago and was made in the 1940s. It's all cotton. It may have been a kit, or she may have used the Aunt Martha transfers to create the individual blocks. We're still doing ongoing research in all the designs because this is only about half of the designs that were done for this block. And it's wonderful looking for all these patterns for these cute little African American children at play and doing their daily chores. It's a very exceptional piece. Unfortunately, because this was the 1940s, very shortly after, Aunt Martha discontinued the design. So it's not very common. The next quilt is String Piece Stars. It's 71 by 86. Again, unknown maker, but the quilt itself is from Kansas in the 1920s. It's all cotton, hand pieced to a foundation, machine assembled, and hand quilted. Now, string piecing was a very popular way to use those scraps from dressmaking. These stars are smaller in size than usual. Usually we would see these stars much larger in one of these scrap quilts. But I think it makes these blocks very eye-catching and, very charming. The next quilt is an Ocean Wave. It's 68 by 84. It was made by Eleanor Sampson, who was a Mennonite woman in southern Illinois in the 1870s. It's all cotton, hand-pieced, and quilted. Mrs. Sampson made many quilts for victims of the Civil War, both sides, as part of the Sanitary Commission project. This was one of her personal favorites, and she kept it for her own use. The next quilt is a Tulip Applique. It's 75 by 80. The quilt is from Kentucky from the 1870s. By all rights, this quilt probably shouldn't exist. It's all cotton, hand-pieced, hand-quilted, and machine appliqued on a treadle. Machine applique from this time period is extremely unusual, though we know that women use those treadle sewing machines to do whatever they could when they got them, and they put them to use. Just like we do today, we get a new toy, we want to try all its tricks. And the machine applique here is just absolutely wonderful for the time period. Go home and try that on your treadle. Let me tell you, it'll drive you a little crazy. The next quilt is a Starburst. It's 75 by 95. Again, maker unknown, but the quilt came from New England, and this is an 1830s quilt. It is all cotton, hand-pieced and quilted. Diamond quilts, especially Blazing Stars and Starbursts, were very popular as scrap quilts in the 1830s. This next quilt is a Central Medallion. Now this is a very early quilt from around 1800. It is from the New England area, we think, although some have looked at this and think it might be from the Charleston region. The maker's name is Mary Smith, which doesn't help us much for research. It's all cotton, hand-pieced and quilted. In this quilt we get to see some really early fabrics, including a hand-painted calico from the 1770s. That's this fabric right here. The toile fabrics here, the blue and whites, are from right around the turn of the century, 1800. And there are some other very unique fabrics in here that we're still researching. These very oriental looking corners here, and some of the other edge fabrics along here. But a very early quilt. And our last quilt today is a Bethlehem Star. My favorite name for this quilt is Quilted to Death. It was made by M.A. Anderson in 1855, and we know that because she corded her name and the date up here in this triangle. It's hand-pieced, hand-quilted, hand-stuffed, and corded. This quilt came from an estate near St. Paul, Minnesota, but it was made before Minnesota was a state, so this is a territorial quilt from the St. Paul area. Obviously, this family was fairly wealthy to have this much fabric and for someone to have this much time on their hands. Each of the squares and triangles here in the quilt are in a different quilting design. And the background quilting is a little bit shy of 1/4 inch. So it's a little bit, not quite an 1/8 inch grid, but shy of a 1/4 inch. I want to thank you all for coming out today. Can I have a round of applause for my holders and folders?